The air was heavy that evening, carrying a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, its tall trees swaying slightly under the whisper of the wind. But no birds sang, no animals stirred. It was too quiet, too expectant. Somewhere between the shadows and the dim light of the fading sun, a figure walked slowly, almost cautiously. Each step echoed with a weight that did not come from the earth beneath, but from the burden he carried within himself. His size alone marked him as something apart from the rest of the world. He was a giant, not only in height but in presence, a being who seemed both feared and misunderstood wherever he went. His steps left deep impressions in the soil, as though the land itself bowed beneath him. Beside him walked someone much smaller, fragile in comparison, yet her presence felt equally heavy. She moved with hesitation, stealing glances up at him, searching his face for some sign of comfort, of reassurance. But his eyes told a story she wasn't ready to face. That was when the words escaped her lips, trembling, filled with desperation. "Don't look at me that way." She tried to sound firm, but it came out as a plea. Her voice cracked on the edges of her fear, her vulnerability laid bare under the weight of his gaze. The giant didn't speak. He rarely did. Words felt too small for the things that pressed against his heart. But his eyes, they gave him away. They always did. They burned with something she couldn't name: sorrow, longing, guilt, or perhaps all of them tangled together. He wanted to hide it, to shield her from the truth he carried, but eyes are not so easily tamed. No matter how much he lowered his head, no matter how carefully he tried to turn away, she felt it, she saw it. And the truth he held was too large to be concealed, even by someone like him. The path ahead was uncertain, winding through thick trees that seemed to grow taller with every step, their branches arching above like the ceiling of some ancient cathedral. The forest was not empty, though it appeared so. There was always a sense of being watched, of unseen forces waiting just beyond the reach of light. She felt it, and though she wanted to ask him about it, to demand an explanation, she couldn't bring herself to speak again. The silence between them was already stretched too thin. Every moment it lingered, it threatened to break. He heard her words repeating in his mind. "Don't look at me that way." He wished he could explain. He wished he could tell her why his eyes betrayed him, why they could not hide the truth. But how could he explain something that was bigger than both of them? How could he speak of things that she was not meant to carry? He had sworn to protect her, yet in that vow lay the very thing she feared. For protection sometimes required secrets, and secrets often carried the sharpest kind of pain. The trees thickened and shadows stretched longer. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that crept into the skin and whispered warnings. She rubbed her arms as though to shake it off, but it clung to her. Her eyes darted toward him again, and this time she didn't plead. She simply stared, waiting, her silence louder than any words. He could feel it, the weight of her question pressing against him, even if she didn't speak it aloud. And still, he could not answer. His lips remained shut, but his eyes, traitorous as always, revealed the truth. Something was coming, and it was already too late to turn back. A branch snapped in the distance. The sound was small, almost insignificant, but in that quiet, it was thunder. She jumped, her breath catching in her throat, her steps faltering. He reached out instinctively, his massive hand steadying her shoulder. His touch was gentle, careful, not to frighten her more, but his body tensed. His ears had caught something hers could not. His eyes narrowed toward the darkness between the trees, but again he said nothing. Words were useless here. She knew it by the way his hand lingered, by the way his muscles coiled as though ready to defend. Something was there, something waiting. Her heart pounded, and she wanted to beg him again, not to look at her that way, not to frighten her with the truth his silence screamed. But she bit her tongue. Her fear was real, but so was his. She saw it now raw in his gaze. And if the giant was afraid, then what hope did she have? Still, she followed him because she had no choice. Because even in fear, she trusted him more than she trusted the unknown that surrounded them. The forest closed in tighter, each tree like a sentinel, each shadow like a secret. The path seemed endless, and yet she knew they were drawing closer to something. The giant's eyes gave it away. He could not hide it. No matter how hard he tried, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that wasn't natural. It wasn't the howl of animals or the rustle of leaves. It was something deeper, something that seemed to hum against the bones. She froze, clutching at his arm, her eyes wide. He looked down at her then, his expression heavy with the truth he could no longer keep hidden. His eyes locked onto hers, and she knew, without words, that whatever lay ahead was no accident. They were meant to be here. This was the place he had dreaded reaching, the place he could not protect her from. His silence, his sorrow, all of it pointed to this moment. She shook her head, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "Please," she whispered again, softer now, almost broken. "Don't look at me that way." But he couldn't stop. His eyes had already betrayed him. And in them she saw the reflection of something moving in the darkness behind her, something vast, something waiting, something that was finally ready to step out of the shadows. And before she could turn, before she could even scream, the world around them shifted, the silence shattered. The truth he carried could no longer be hidden. Content which can affect YouTube policy. The ground trembled beneath their feet, though nothing visible had yet emerged from the shadows. She clung tighter to his arm, feeling the heat of his skin against her cold hands. For a moment, she dared not breathe, as if even the smallest sound from her lips might draw the attention of whatever lingered in the dark. The giant's hand twitched, not in fear, but in restraint. He could feel his strength urging him to act, to defend, to strike first if needed. But he stayed still, waiting. His silence wasn't only because words failed him, it was because he knew too well that rushing forward could mean disaster. She searched his face, desperate for answers. She wanted to demand he tell her what was happening, why they had come this way, why he carried that heavy look in his eyes. But each time she opened her mouth, the words froze on her tongue. Something about the forest, about the growing tension, made her voice feel too small, too powerless. So instead, she held her fear inside and tried to steady her steps, though each one felt harder than the last. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed alive. Not alive in the comforting way of birds or animals, but alive with secrets. Every tree seemed to lean closer, listening, whispering things she couldn't understand. The air smelled different here, thicker, sharper, almost metallic, like rain that had not yet fallen. And then she noticed something else. The silence was no longer complete. Somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, there was a faint rhythm, like a low drumbeat, steady and unyielding. She thought at first it was her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, but the giant's expression confirmed otherwise. He had heard it too. She swallowed hard and finally found the courage to whisper, "What is it?" But he didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. He wanted to protect her from the truth, but that same truth was drawing nearer with every second. He could not deny it. He could not turn it away. The path narrowed, forcing them closer together. His massive frame brushed against the trees, leaving scars in the bark. He didn't mean to, but his size made him impossible to conceal, impossible to hide. He had always been too large for the world around him, and tonight that truth felt sharper than ever. She had often wondered what it was like for him, carrying such a body, such strength, in a world that never seemed to fit him. Did it make him lonely? Did it make him wish he could shrink into something smaller, less noticeable? But tonight, watching the way he moved, she realized that his size was both his burden and his gift. Whatever was waiting for them, only someone like him could stand against it. Her chest tightened as she thought about what that meant. If he was preparing to face something, then so was she, whether she was ready or not. She thought back to the first time she had met him, how terrifying he had seemed at first. His shadow had swallowed hers, his silence had pressed on her like a weight. And yet, she had learned quickly that beneath the surface, there was a gentleness. In him, a kind of sadness that softened the rough edges. That sadness lived in his eyes still, though tonight it burned brighter, sharper, as though the truth inside him had reached the point of breaking. The drumbeat grew louder. Not fast, but steady, each thud shaking the ground in rhythm with her racing heart. She realized then what it reminded her of: the sound of footsteps, but impossibly heavy, impossibly far apart. Something was moving, something that matched the weight of the giant beside her, but carried none of his warmth. She shivered, though the night was not yet cold enough to explain it. The giant finally stopped walking. His massive hand lifted slightly, signaling her to stay behind him. She froze, staring at his broad back, the way his shoulders squared as though preparing for a blow. For a moment, she thought he might finally speak, but again, he stayed silent. The truth was there, hanging between them, too large to put into words. She could feel the urge rising inside her again. The need to tell him not to look at her that way, not to let his eyes reveal what he could not say. But before the words could form, a shape flickered in the distance. It wasn't clear, just the outline of something moving between the trees. Larger than any beast she had ever known, yet quick, too quick for its size. She gasped, stumbling back, and his hand reached for her instinctively, steadying her before she could fall. His grip was strong, grounding, but it also told her something she hadn't wanted to admit. He was afraid too not of being hurt, but of failing her. The forest seemed to close in around them, the branches whispering louder now, though the words made no sense. She wondered if he understood them, if his silence wasn't just his nature, but his knowledge of what they were walking into. The thought unsettled her more than the shadows themselves. If he knew, then why had he brought her here? What truth was he hiding behind those eyes that refused to look away? Her thoughts tumbled over one another as the shape ahead grew clearer. It wasn't one figure, it was several. At least 3, maybe more, moving with impossible coordination, their outlines blurred by the darkness. They didn't speak, they didn't rush forward. They only watched, circling slowly, waiting for something. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to beg him to turn back. But she knew by the way his body stood firm that there was no turning back now. This was the place he had always known they would reach. This was the truth he could not shield her from. Her breath came shallow, her chest tight with dread. She thought of the words she had already spoken, "Don't look at me that way." She thought of how his eyes had betrayed him, how they always betrayed him. And she realized with sudden clarity that what she feared most was not the shadows circling them, but the way his gaze told her that this night would change everything. Whatever truth he carried, whatever secret he held, it was tied to these figures waiting in the dark. The drumbeat ceased, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. She could hear her own heartbeat now, wild and uneven. The giant shifted slightly, his massive hand lowering as if ready to strike, but still he did not move. The shadows waited, she waited. And in the space between them, the truth hung like a blade, ready to fall. She wanted to speak again, to plead with him, to tell him she wasn't ready for whatever was coming. But no words came. Instead, she found herself staring into his eyes, searching them one last time for the comfort she longed for. And what she saw there made her knees weaken. There was no comfort, no reassurance, only the unshakable truth. He knew them. He knew what they were, and he knew they had finally caught up to him. The forest held its breath again, and she felt the cliff edge beneath her feet. The sense that one step further would send them both tumbling into something they could never return from. She gripped his arm tighter, her voice finally breaking through in a whisper that trembled in the cold air. "Tell me, please." But he said nothing. His silence was the loudest sound of all. And then, from the darkness, something stepped forward. The first figure stepped into the pale light that filtered through the branches, and she saw just enough to steal the breath from her chest. It wasn't an animal, though it moved with the same silent grace. It wasn't human either, not in the way. She understood the word. Its outline was too tall, too stretched, its limbs long and unnaturally bent. Its face was hidden, shrouded in shadow, but the air around it carried a charge that prickled her skin. And then another shape followed, and another, until the clearing seemed crowded by forms that should not exist. They stood without speaking, but their presence alone was a language. They were not strangers to the giant. She could see it in the way his body stiffened, in the heaviness of his breath. For the first time, she thought she understood his silence. It wasn't only a choice, it was a shield. Words could not capture the weight of this truth, nor could they soften it. He had known they would find him, that they would find her too if she walked by his side. His eyes betrayed all of it, and though she had begged him not to look at her that way, she realized now that it was the only way he could warn her. His silence had been a mercy, but it no longer protected her. The shadows shifted, and for a moment, she thought they were preparing to attack. Her body pressed closer to his, her fingers digging into his arm, but he didn't move. He didn't lift his hand to fight, not yet. Instead, he stood as if bracing for something unseen. That was when she noticed it. The smallest flicker of light in the nearest figure's chest, like an ember hidden under ash. It pulsed faintly, slow and steady, in time with the strange drumbeat they had heard before. The others had the same glow, each heartbeat faint but undeniable. It was not just light, it was life. She wanted to ask what they were, but fear choked the words from her throat. Instead, her mind raced back to the moments that had led them here, to the way the giant had watched the horizon days ago with that same heavy sorrow in his gaze. He had known they were being followed. He had known the forest was leading them toward this meeting, and she had followed him without question, too caught up in the safety of his shadow to see what stalked it. The tension hung thick in the air, but then something shifted. The figure closest to them tilted its head, and for the first time, she heard a sound, not speech, not exactly. It was more like a hum, a vibration that thrummed in her bones. The sound was low, steady, and though she couldn't understand it, she could feel its meaning. It wasn't meant for her. It was meant for him. The giant's body flinched ever so slightly, a movement so small she might have missed it if she hadn't been pressed so close. His eyes closed for a moment, his jaw tightening as if holding back a flood. When he opened them again, his gaze fell on her, heavy with the truth she had begged him not to reveal. She knew then that these creatures weren't strangers to him. They were tied to him in a way she couldn't yet grasp. Perhaps they were part of his past, or maybe they were the very reason he carried sorrow in his eyes. Whatever the truth, it had found them now. Her heart pounded harder as a second hum joined the first, then another, until the air itself seemed to tremble with their voices. The sound was almost unbearable, and she pressed her hands against her ears, but it didn't help. It wasn't sound that hurt, it was the way it reached inside her, stirring fear she didn't want to name. She looked up at the giant, hoping for guidance, for comfort. But he was locked in place, his chest rising and falling with effort. The sound was for him, and he could not ignore it. For a brief moment, she wondered if he might go to them, if he might leave her there in the forest, small and helpless against the dark. The thought struck harder than any fear of the figures themselves. She had followed him because she believed he would protect her, because she believed his silence meant safety. If that belief shattered, she would have nothing left, but he didn't move toward them. His massive hand lowered until it brushed against her shoulder, a small but steadying touch. He wasn't abandoning her. Not yet. Instead, he turned his body, slightly, shielding her from the glow of their chests, from the way their shadows seemed to stretch forward like reaching hands. That one gesture gave her strength, though it also deepened her confusion. If he knew them, why did he fear them? If they were his kind, why did he protect her from them? The questions churned inside her, but she dared not ask. Instead, her eyes darted to the edges of the clearing, where the trees leaned closer as if hungry for the scene unfolding beneath them. The forest itself felt alive with anticipation, as though it had been waiting for this confrontation far longer than either of them realized. She thought back to the stories whispered in villages, the tales of beings too large for the earth, who carried secrets too heavy for humans to bear. She had never believed them, not until she met him. And even then, she had wanted to believe he was different, that he was gentle despite his size. But now, staring at the figures in the clearing, she wondered if those stories had been warnings, not legends. Her fear tightened its grip, but alongside it grew something else, a strange, aching curiosity. If the giant had lived his life carrying this burden, if he had hidden this truth in his eyes all along, then maybe she had been blind to the depth of his struggle. Maybe she had never really known him at all. The humming stopped, and the silence returned like a blade. The figures didn't move, but their stillness was worse than their song. It was expectation, waiting, as though they had spoken and now demanded an answer. The giant's breath slowed, his chest heavy, and for a moment she thought he might finally speak. Her heart leapt, bracing for words that would break the silence, but none came. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, his eyes carrying all the weight his lips refused. Her throat burned with questions. But before she could ask, another sound cut through the forest. A rustling, faint but sharp, from the trees behind them. She whipped around, her pulse surging, and caught sight of movement. More shadows, more figures, slipping between the trees, closing off the path they had taken. They weren't alone in the clearing anymore. They were surrounded. Her knees weakened, and she gripped his arm tighter, her voice breaking in a whisper. Why are they here? This time, she thought he might answer. His jaw worked, his gaze flicking between the figures in front of him and the ones behind. But once again, silence was all he gave her. Silence, and the unshakable truth in his eyes. They weren't here by accident. They had come for him. And now, because of him, they had come for her too. The forest seemed to draw tighter, the clearing shrinking with every heartbeat. She knew. There was no escape, not from this, not from them. Her chest ached with the weight of the unknown, the unbearable need to understand. But even as her fear rose, so did a quiet determination. If she was to be caught in this storm, she would not face it blind. She would demand the truth, even if it broke her. Her lips parted, her voice shaking but steady enough to pierce the silence. Tell me what you're hiding. And for the first time since they had entered the forest, the giant's eyes closed not to conceal the truth, but to hold it back a moment longer. The figures waited. She waited, and the truth pressed closer, ready to shatter the silence forever. The forest seemed to bend inward, as though every tree was leaning closer to watch. The figures stood still, their faint glow pulsing like hidden hearts, and yet the Air vibrated with an invisible tension that made her skin crawl. The giant stood between her and them, his massive frame a barrier, but she felt no safer. His silence was heavy, almost unbearable now, and though she wanted to trust him, her chest tightened with doubt. She could hear her own breath, quick and shallow, but his was steady, controlled, like a man preparing for something he could not avoid. Another sound broke the stillness, a sharp snap of wood, close behind them. She spun around and saw the shapes pressing in, more of them, their outlines shifting with the shadows, their glowing chests flickering in unison. They were tightening the circle. Every escape was gone. She pressed closer to the giant, her small frame nearly swallowed by his, and whispered, "They're everywhere." He didn't respond, but his hand flexed at his side, the first sign that he might be ready to act. The humming started again, deeper this time, layered with tones that clashed and vibrated until the air itself felt too thick to breathe. It wasn't a song, it was a demand. Her bones ached under the sound, and her vision blurred as though her very body was rejecting the presence of these beings. She gasped and stumbled, her knees threatening to give out. But before she could fall, his massive hand caught her arm, steadying her once more. His touch was gentle, but his eyes burned with something fierce now, sharper than sorrow, closer to rage. For the first time, she felt the storm inside him break through his silence. She could see it in the way his chest rose, in the way his shoulders squared. He had tried to hide it, tried to shield her from the truth, but there was no hiding now. He knew these creatures. He knew what they wanted. And it was clear from the way he glared into their glow that they hadn't come for peace. The figures stepped closer. Their movements were deliberate, in perfect rhythm with one another, like dancers following an unseen command. Each step made the earth quiver, not as strongly as his, but enough to remind her that they were heavy, powerful, dangerous. Her heart hammered wildly, and she whispered, barely able to form the words, "Why won't you tell me?" He looked down at her then, his eyes filled with all the things he had kept locked away. And for just a breath, she thought he might finally break his silence. But he only tightened his jaw, and the truth stayed caged behind his lips. His silence was unbearable, but the way his gaze lingered told her everything she needed to know. He was afraid not for himself, but for her. The clearing pulsed with light as the figures' chests flared brighter, as though the rhythm had reached its peak. The humming grew louder, pressing into her skull until she thought she might scream. She clutched her head, her voice trembling. Make it stop, but he could not. His hands curled into fists, his body tensed, and still he did not move. He was waiting. For what, she couldn't understand, but the weight of his patience was terrifying. Suddenly, one of the figures broke from the circle, striding forward into full view. Its body was twisted and elongated, its movements wrong yet precise. Its glow pulsed brighter than the others, and for the first time she saw a glimpse of its face. Not human, but not entirely alien either. There was something hauntingly familiar in its shape, as if it had once been something closer to them, but had been stretched beyond recognition. She recoiled, stumbling back, her chest aching with terror. Giant stepped forward at last, blocking her from its gaze. His presence was enough to halt the creature's advance, but only for a moment. The others began to hum louder, their glow intensifying, and she realized this was not a meeting, it was a summons. They weren't asking. They were calling him back. Her eyes widened as she pieced it together, though she hardly wanted to believe it. These beings weren't strangers. They were his kind. Or worse, they were part of what he had once been, part of the truth he had buried. She stared up at him, her voice cracking. You knew they would come. His silence this time was an answer. His eyes didn't deny it. The glow swelled brighter still, flooding the clearing with an eerie light, and the trees themselves seemed to shudder under the weight of it. The humming was unbearable now, shaking her bones, rattling her teeth. She covered her ears, but it only grew stronger. And then, in the chaos, she saw it, the faint shimmer of tears in his eyes, hidden beneath his fierce glare. She had begged him not to look at her that way, not to show her the truth his eyes carried. But here, in this moment, his gaze told her everything she feared. He couldn't stop what was coming. The first figure stepped closer again, and this time the giant moved with him. His body loomed larger, his chest rising with a deep breath that shook the ground beneath his feet. His hand dropped to his side, fingers curling into a fist so tight his knuckles blanched. His silence shattered in its own way, not with words, but with the promise of action. Her pulse raced as the distance between them closed. The figures circled tighter, their glow merging into one blinding rhythm. The forest groaned as though it too feared what was about to happen. She clung to him, her whisper trembling in the air. "Don't leave me." He didn't answer. He couldn't. But the way his body shifted, towering and unyielding, told her he would fight until there was nothing left. The air split with a final hum, deeper and louder than anything before. The ground cracked, the trees bent, and the clearing filled with a storm of sound and light. The figures moved as one, stepping closer, their glow reaching for him. He roared then, not a word, not a name, but a sound pulled from the deepest part of him, a sound that shook the night to its core. She stumbled back, shielding her face from the blinding glow, her heart screaming in her chest. The giant surged forward, every step trembling the earth, and the shadows closed in around them. Both thought the truth was no longer hidden. The moment he had feared had come, and as the forest swallowed them in light and sound, she realized they were standing on the very edge of everything, about to step into a storm that would change their lives forever. But what that storm would bring, neither of them could yet know. A storm of sound and light swallowed everything. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the humming was inside her bones, rattling through every breath. The giant roared again, a raw sound that shook the ground and tore through the unnatural rhythm of the glowing figures. For a moment, the forest itself seemed to bend under his voice. The figures staggered back, their rhythm breaking, their glow faltering. She forced her eyes open, just enough to see him standing tall against them, his massive frame lit by the strange light. The sight of him was both terrifying and breathtaking. He wasn't just shielding her anymore, he was revealing what he had hidden all along. His silence, his sorrow, his eyes that betrayed him, it was all connected to this. The figures weren't just enemies. They were his past, the shadow of what he once was or could have become. They had come to pull him back, to claim him, but he was fighting not for himself, but for her. She stumbled forward, clinging to his arm as the humming rose again. "You don't have to do this alone," she cried, though her voice was nearly swallowed by the storm. He turned, and for the first time since she had known him, his lips parted to speak. His voice was deep, trembling, but steady. "I do." Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of everything he had hidden. He wasn't pushing her away, he was protecting her with the truth. This was his battle. Her heart ached, but she understood then why his eyes had always looked that way. He had carried the knowledge that this moment would come, and he had carried the fear of what it would mean for her. She had begged him not to look at her that way, but his gaze had been the only warning he could give. Now as the figures closed in once more, she knew she had to trust him. The giant stepped forward, his fists tightening. With each step, the ground shuddered, and the glow of the figures seemed to weaken. Their humming grew frantic, uneven, as though his defiance was breaking the bond that tied them together. One lunged toward him, its twisted limbs reaching out, but he struck with a force that split the air. The figure collapsed in a burst of dim light, its glow fading into the soil. The others recoiled, their rhythm stuttering. She gasped, not only in fear but in awe. He wasn't just resisting them, he was stronger than they were. She realized then what they wanted: his strength, his life, the power that made him different. But he had chosen to give it not to them, but to her. Every time he shielded her, every time he kept silent so she could feel safe. The battle raged in flashes of light and thunderous strikes. Each time he fell back, she thought it might be the end, but each time he rose again, his eyes burning brighter. She had never seen him like this, no longer burdened by silence, but alive in defiance. And yet, she could see the toll it was taking. His breaths grew heavier, his movements slower. He was winning, but it was costing him everything. She couldn't stand by any longer. Her fear had followed her every step through the forest, but now something stronger rose in her chest. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood at his side. The figures circled again, their glow flickering, and she raised her voice against the storm. "You can't have him." Her words were small compared to the sound around them, but they struck true. For the first time, the figures turned their glow toward her. The humming faltered. She didn't understand why, but she saw it. Their rhythm broke at the sound of her voice. She looked up at the giant, and his eyes widened with something like realization. She was the key. The glow swelled as the figures lunged together, desperate now. The giant roared once more, wrapping one massive arm around her and holding her close as the storm crashed down. She buried her face against him, trusting herself. Together they faced the blinding light as it burst across the clearing. Then silence. When she opened her eyes, the forest was still. The figures were gone. Only the faint shimmer of their glow lingered in the air before fading into nothing. The trees stood tall again, the ground steady beneath her feet. The storm had passed. She turned to him, breathless, her voice breaking. "It's over." He sank to one knee, his massive chest rising and falling with exhaustion. His silence returned, but it no longer felt like a wall. It was peace. She touched his arm gently, searching his eyes, and this time she didn't beg him to look away. What she saw there was no longer sorrow, it was relief. For the first time, she understood the truth. He had carried the weight of his past alone, afraid of what it would mean for her. But when the storm came, she had stood with him, and together they had faced it. His silence had been his shield, but now his eyes told a different story. He was free, not from who he was, but from the fear of letting her see it. The forest seemed softer now, the air lighter. She rose to her feet and reached for his hand. "Come on," she whispered. "Let's go home." He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The way he rose, towering but gentle, the way he let her guide him down the path, they were words enough as they walked back through the trees. She thought about the way his eyes had haunted her, the way she had begged him not to look at her that way. She realized now that what she had feared wasn't his truth, but her own fear of facing it. His eyes had always been honest, even when his lips stayed still. They had carried sorrow, yes, but also love, also hope. The forest faded behind them, the night growing quiet again. The path stretched ahead, uncertain but open. She leaned into him, her steps lighter than before, and for the first time since the journey began, she felt no dread. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And though he said nothing, she knew. She saw it in his eyes, clear at last, free from the shadows. He had given her the truth she once begged him to hide, and in doing so, he had given her something greater, the strength to face it by his side. The storm was over, but its echo would remain with them always, a reminder. Of the night the silence broke, and the truth could no longer be hidden, and as the stars pierced the sky above, she understood what it all meant. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and sometimes the eyes tell the story the heart cannot bear to say.